Welcome this afternoon to this service of remembrance and celebration for the life of George McCauley, a husband, father, grandfather, Olympic athlete, dedicated employee, and friend. My name is Sheila Murray, and I am one of the ministers at Islington United Church here in Toronto, and I'm so pleased to preside at the service today, partly because for 10 years, George and I were neighbors on Glen Agar, 5 doors apart. Our paths never crossed, as often happens when people are busy with their own lives. But at least once a week, I would walk down Glen Agar, enter my house, and tell my ex-husband he really should have bought that house up the street because I liked it so much better than ours. And so when I met with Catherine and Nancy this week, we sort of felt like this was meant to be today. There's a reading from the book of Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew scripture where the writer muses about the meaning of life. You may remember it from the song, Turn, Turn, Turn. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to be silent and a time to speak. As our time together this afternoon unfolds, you will hear about the various seasons of George's life as 3 speakers remember the seasons of which they were a part. In between our second and third speaker, you'll enjoy a slideshow, again highlighting the different seasons of his life. We are pleased today to have Toronto Fire Chief Jim Jessup joining us. George and the Jessup family have a long history. Jim Jessup Sr. worked with George at Yorkville Fire Hall for years as a senior member of his crew and a close personal friend. George believed that everyone should aspire to be a firefighter, and Jim Jr. was no exception. Young Jimmy, as George called him, was going to be a chief someday. And we're so pleased to have him here in that role today to offer some words about George.
Thank you. It's funny, I do a lot of these. This one's going to be harder. Ecclesiastes wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart, until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us through the awful grace of God." Good afternoon. On behalf of the over 3,000 women and men of the Toronto Fire Service, I offer my sincerest condolences to Nancy, Catherine, and their families and friends, Toronto Fire brothers and sisters of retired Captain George McCauley. I want to say how honored I am to be here with you and to have the invitation extended, and express the gratitude of the City of Toronto for the service Captain McCauley that began with the former Toronto Fire Department in 1955. I'm often in the unfortunate position when speaking at these events of not having the privilege of serving with the person or knowing the person. Today's not the case. I have known George and his family for over 45 years. And my vivid memories of my childhood were visiting the Yorkville Fire Station and watching George and my father respond to calls and listening to the stories from my father about working for George and the reverence for which my dad held him. George had a well-earned reputation for demanding the most from his firefighters and protecting those who treated the Toronto Fire Department the way it deserved. In fact, George often said to me over the years as my career progressed to treat staff the way they treat the fire department, and that not all staff are equal. And I truly believe that. George was a legend on the Toronto Fire Department, rising through the war years of old Toronto, instilling lessons in me and countless others, a number of that are here, about honor, sacrifice, and duty that will remain with me until my last day. Many of us here understand too painfully that heroism comes with sacrifice. George and his family knew this truth, and he never hesitated to respond anytime someone called for help. He was devoted, he was true, he was brave, and he made a choice. He chose to live a life of service. He chose to put himself in harm's way to be a guardian to the people of this great city. We will never be able to thank George for his service and sacrifice, but this we can do. We will remember him always. We will remember that in his life he embodied all that we as firefighters and citizens can hope to be. George lived a fundamental principle that binds all firefighters, that I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, that we look out for one another, that there's something bigger than each of us individually that we have to be true to. And the way George lived that principle is more important to the Toronto Fire Service, and dare I say society at large today, than ever before. One of the memories I will cherish until my last day is spending time with George this past May. George was having a good day, and we spoke at length about family, old friends, firefighters, and of course the fire department. It was my last conversation with George. George, may the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. The rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand.
Thank you, Jim, for those beautiful words. Grant Summers is a longtime friend of George and a member of the Argonaut Rowing Club. George and Grant worked on many projects together right up until the summer of 2025 when Grant put together the event during the Paris Olympics, and I'm sorry I have the year wrong. George was honored as the oldest living Canadian Olympic rower and spoke to current members of the club. Thank you, Grant, today for your willingness to share some memories of George with us.
Thank you for having me here today, Catherine and Nancy. And thank you, Jim, for your words. That was beautiful. It's funny, many of the things that you said about George, and as a firefighter, I think are also very true as a rower because, you know, the discipline and the dedication and support he showed to everybody was, you know, it was just remarkable. So I think that it's fitting as a rower that this celebration takes place today. Many of our fellow Argonauts are in Peterborough, Ontario, competing at the head of the Trent Regatta, which is a huge rowing event, one of the biggest in the country. There are members that might otherwise be here today to celebrate the life of George but cannot make it, such as longtime Argo Secretary Judy Sutcliffe, who is chief umpire at this regatta. She and many others send their condolences to the family. Like our president, Jason Van Ravensway, left a very heartfelt note on behalf of the club on the Turner and Porter online obituary section. I'd like to share a paragraph with you, if I may. George was an Olympian, a leader, a true builder of Canadian rowing. His time with the 1952 Olympic 8 showed his strength as an athlete, but it was his decades of leadership at the Argonaut Rowing Club that left the biggest mark. He guided our club through difficult times, preserved our history, and mentored countless members. Quite simply, the Argonaut Rowing Club would not be here today without his dedication and steady hand. And another Argo fundraising director, Irina Rubin, wrote a letter which she'll be sharing with Catherine and Nancy soon, but I'd like to read a paragraph of that as well. From the moment I first came into the clubhouse, I sensed that the walls and oars and photos were alive with stories and memories. In particular, the presence of George's legacy is impossible to miss. He stood for something larger than himself, the ideals of passion, perseverance, deep commitment, and excellence. And he allowed the next generation to stand on his shoulders. Irina has been working closely with the family, planning for the construction of a memorial bench facing our watercourse as a lasting legacy to George. If you would like to donate to this, there are cards located in the lobby and beside the guest book with a barcode that would scan and take you to the website with that page if you would like to do so. And to further honor George, our club is renaming the trophy presented to the Outstanding Oarsman of the Year from ARC Oarsman of the Year to the George McCauley Oarsman of the Year Award. And I think he would be very happy to hear that because he was so passionate about rowing and competition. But to me, George was part friend, part historian, part mentor, and part family, all wrapped into one giant guy. I joined the Argonaut Club nearly 30 years ago and met George soon thereafter. He and Mary liked to visit our print shop in Mississauga frequently, and we produced a large backbar print of the 1952 crew, photographed in the first dead heat finish at the Helsinki Olympics. This still resides at the club. Many a day we shared in rowing banter, race strategies, and techniques to get faster. I myself competed for the club for 19 years, and I learned a lot from him. It was amazing to still see the passion he had for the sport. Even into his 90s, you could see his eyes light up when I brought another Argo Olympian, Greg Rokosh, to visit him 2 years ago when he came to town for our history book launch. They spent over an hour reminiscing and chatting and laughing, and it was really a beautiful thing to watch them together for that brief time. And for years, George hinted at this. It was a big day when he actually revealed to me the secret of his three-stroke racing start. As legend has it, was the fastest in the world at the time. He actually wrote it out and gave me a copy. This is the start the crew used to train against a Russian single sculler while training in Helsinki for the Olympics. You might think if you're not a rower that a boat with 8 oarsmen could easily beat a single sculler, but when you consider the huge amount of force required to overcome the inertia of a 2,000-pound boat versus a 160-pound sculler in a light boat without the weight of a coxswain, the small boat can easily accelerate much quicker, much like a bicycle would against a freight train until it gets moving. Usually within 20 strokes or so, they would catch up. But this Russian sculler could not beat them, and he said every other boat that he raced in those games and practice he could beat except the Canadians. But it's a long, I'm sure many of you have heard the story of him at the Helsinki Olympics and how their boat was destroyed and the adversity they overcame. But they did very well in the end nonetheless. But this little vignette is just one of dozens of stories George would share with me. And he taught me about the great old legends of the club, Joe Wright and Jack Guest, tales from a century ago. He documented all 13 original Olympic Argonaut crews prior to the national team selection process and all of the glory days of the club, why we were considered one of the premier sports clubs in North America. He helped inspire my love of history for the club. And George knew the history better than anybody in the 150 years of the club. Nobody knew the history like George. He tirelessly dedicated himself to learning everything about everybody who was anybody at the club. So, and as he got on in years, I took over the role of de facto historian at the club, which led to the creation of Argonaut Olympian features, which now reside on our website, the creation of the Argonaut Historical Society, and the production of our book, Perseverance and Glory, The History of the Argonaut Rowing Club. The genesis of that book was thanks in no small part to George and his archives, and much of the information that he passed on to us, we are forever grateful to have. When visiting George years ago, I noticed a framed newspaper article featuring George as Canadian Firefighter of the Year. I think it was 1984. And I was completely shocked because he had never mentioned that to me before. And then he said how he had crawled through a burning apartment single-handedly in High Park and pulled somebody out and saved their life. And I was shocked, but that was George. In many ways, he was very understated. I knew about his rowing career, but I was amazed at what an incredible career he also had as a firefighter. And when we weren't talking about history or rowing, we shared some nice moments together. George and his late wife, Mary, had my wife Virginia and our daughters up to their cottage for the weekend, probably 20 years ago now. We had a great time just hanging out with them. Mary was such a lovely person who was always at his side. She's also dearly missed. And in those moments, they were like family to us, and I'll remember the good times we shared. As luck would have it, when George moved to Dell Manor, his retirement home, he was right next to my mother-in-law, Grace. How random is that? So even after he left his home, we got to see and visit with him all the time. The Argonaut Club wouldn't be what it is today without him. He contributed so much to keeping the memories and the legends alive. And these memories that we have on our website of past greatness help promote and inspire new generations of athletes to join our club and flourish. I can say right now the junior membership at our club is as high as it's ever been due to the booming, even during the booming 40s when George and his cohort of kids from Western Tech and Humberside and Etobicoke Collegiate and Parkdale Collegiate started rowing there. They're all back now and they're in bigger numbers. All roads led to Argos then, and they still do now. We have national team and Olympian members. As recently as the last 2 Olympic Games, we've won gold and silver medals, people from our club that have competed. We've completely renovated our club. We have new 250-foot docks for our ever-expanding fleet of boats. We have new change rooms and banquet facilities. So George leaves this world as he leaves the Argonaut Club in the best shape it's been in for 75 years. On behalf of the Argonaut Club and me personally, George, may all your waters be calm, may your load be light, and may your eyes always be on the horizon, searching for that perfect stroke. God bless you, my friend.
it must, the seasons end. So a new one may begin, yet from one May, July to June. On my lips, a father's tune. My time is near, I'll be home soon, and you'll sing to me a father's tune.
And now for perhaps the most important season of George's life, his family, and Catherine, his daughter, will share those reflections with us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today to honor George as he goes off to join our Mother Mary, who has been patiently waiting, as she did for years, for him to arrive safely home. Thank you to Jim and Grant for their friendship and kind words. And with your patience, I will try to add a few stories to the photos you just saw. George as a superhero. Kids often think their dad is a superhero, with size difference being obvious in the early years. This, of course, evens out as kids grow taller. In our family, George was always the tallest. He had awesome uniforms. He left for work in fire station clothes and dress uniforms he had for special occasions, including white gloves, which I thought was very impressive. It was when you saw him in full turnout gear that he morphed into the action hero, with huge black boots, heavy coat, and helmet adding to his height. For many of us, when you hear sirens and see firefighters running towards us, there's instant confidence that help is on the way. George told stories to us, to younger firefighters, and then to his grandchildren. How many of us have careers that create stories shared through generations? Maybe that explains why firefighting has a history of being a family business, with multiple generations following the path, including ours and the Jessup family. Great fires. That was a great fire. I heard this phrase all my life. George described a great fire by the spectacular way it moved and grew, and how firefighters both reacted and anticipated what would happen. And if it was a really great fire, the team expanded, calling in more trucks and more firefighters. Church fires were some of his favorites, as he described all the open space and wood creating the ingredients for something really big. Amazingly, fires were even something he listened to with his scanner that notified him of what was going on. And one evening, when my mother must have been out, George came to me and said, "Get ready, we're going out." We stood and watched a great fire. George described what the different trucks were meant to do, how each person had a task, and what must have been happening inside the building. It was like a color commentary, complete with a running thread of what he thought should be happening. And then I discovered that George was not the only superhero, but he was part of a club. Another glimpse into the life he led came when I was dropped off at Yorkville Fire Hall for a short visit while my mother left for an errand. I got a full tour, of course, and then sat at a table and watched the crew prepare a meal that looked to me like it would have fed an army. This was another fire hall tradition, the Sunday meal. Then the bells went off. The next moments were methodical, executed with ninja-like precision. And yes, not to disappoint, some slid down the fire pole, and each of them jumped into the boots that were carefully set up around the truck. Coats on, the huge glass door opened, and then they were gone. So you might be thinking, what about the little girl in the station? George had taken me to the floor watch room where one crew member had remained. And that was a great relief to my mother, who arrived shortly after to find me learning all about city maps and radios. I didn't really get the danger until I was older. Even in his last year, George would describe in great detail 6 fires where he narrowly escaped death. And none of those were the fire that earned him the 1985 Firefighter of the Year award. He said that that award was a great honor, but he was just doing his job. A clue to the danger was also the smell of smoke on his clothes when he returned home. Nancy, being 7 years older, had a better sense of the risks, and this sense had a big impact on her. George described the fire department, as both Jim and Grant have alluded, as the best job in the world. How many people can honestly say that they love going to work every single day? He believed that becoming a firefighter didn't happen during training or from the manuals, but rather from the elders. George's elders were the veterans of World War I and II, including our grandfather Alec, who became a platoon chief. War vets were their heroes. To follow those guys into anything, he would say. As a captain, George became an elder and mentored many, including Fire Chief Jim Jessup. Families are the family we get to choose, and at the age of 16, the Argonaut Club became George's second home, his sanctuary, his playground, and where his lifelong friendships were made. Coach K. Smith became a father figure, and his teammates became his brothers. Like families, there was rivalry and competitiveness, but also great love and loyalty. As his crewmates died over the years, George would retell stories of their great adventures, traveling to competitions, meeting new people, getting into mischief, and having the time of their lives. As you saw from the photos from Helsinki, the Olympic crew walked like they owned the world. During the 2024 Paris Olympics, as Grant mentioned, George was honored at the Argonaut Club as the oldest living Canadian rower, Olympic rower, in the same building where he had spent decades as a young athlete, Canadian champion, Olympian, and later club manager and historian. That day, he spoke as an elder, recounting his experience and sharing wisdom with a group of young rowers. As the historian for the club, he leaves a legacy with the George McCauley collection of rowing photos and memorabilia that is housed in the Toronto Archives. George could also build anything. George and Mary bought the cottage property on 3 Mile Lake the year I was born. They were taken by boat along the shoreline looking for the perfect spot to buy. The trees were dense and it was hard to predict how the property would look, so it was the rock formation on the shoreline that was the clincher. The rock formation became the playground for Nancy and I, followed years later with the 4 grandkids. With a cement base poured and frame raised, George built the cottage. No detail was missed, since George was meticulous, to the point that he laid out every piece of cedar plank outside one by one to ensure that they complemented one another. There was no job that tools, a case of beer, and intrepid friends couldn't meet, including one weekend where George and his old pal Don Douglas cut down trees and built a dock. The fire hydrant you saw in the photo was added years later and became a misguided sense of security for the other cottagers. When we had to sell the cottage, the hydrant went to a younger Toronto firefighter who also had a cottage on the lake. His greatest love was Mary, who he fell instantly in love with at first sight. On that fateful day, Mary walked past 91 Pearson Avenue towards her home around the corner. Even in his 90s, George could describe the first time he laid eyes on her. Exactly what she was wearing, a white blouse with a Peter Pan collar. He knew what that meant. A dark skirt and a matching purse and shoes. It turns out that Mary would normally walk home along Marion Street, but that afternoon, she took another route that took her right past George's house. She was literally the girl next door. In the past few years, my son Brian and I have been poring over George's massive photo collection. For today, I chose photos of the two of them over their 60-year marriage to show how completely devoted they were to one another. Combing over the photos, we saw the same pose, the same look, and the same connection. George as a dad. George's love extended to Nancy and I, and later to his grandchildren who he adored. Anthony with the clear resemblance, kind heart and charm. Philip with great athletic ability and competitive instinct. Renee, who shared his gift as an artist and a calling to be of service, to care for others. And Brian, who shares his passion for history, artifacts, and legacy stories. Family legacy extends beyond the fire department. You can still find photos of George's early athletic achievements in the halls of Western Tech School, the swimming, basketball, and later the rowing team. Also, in the halls of that school, you can find George's sister Heather's name on a plaque as valedictorian, and more recently, the glorious hallway murals designed and painted by his adored Renee. What a privilege it is that George lived long enough to be a great grandfather to 4 beautiful children, Emmett, Madeline, Sienna, and Kira. It is a privilege to get to know a person in real time, and through his stories and photos later on, we are grateful for the stories shared on the condolence page. I'd like to end with part of one of them submitted by Brian Carr, a family friend from the cottage. Brian wrote, "George's life is one to be celebrated. He was a dedicated family man, an accomplished athlete, and a passionate, humble firefighter. As the story goes, Mary was cutting my mother's hair. They began talking about 3 Mile Lake, where they had been since 1965. From there, the rest was history, more than 50 years of enjoyment they were having. Marty, another Toronto firefighter on the lake, and I would often visit George. Of course, me being a cop, my stories and my voice didn't quite get the same recognition or attention as his. On one of those visits, George mentioned how he'd love to see a huge old dead tree taken down at the waterfront. Well, in March that year, Marty and I decided to take care of it. We were pretty proud of ourselves. When spring came and George returned, we couldn't wait to tell him the good news. George looked at us and smiled and said, "Boys, thank you, but that wasn't on my property." That was George, always with that wit, humility, and easy humor.
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks to all of you for the wonderful memories shared today. Rest assured, I am not going to preach a sermon. I just want to share a few words of reflection. The words of the writer of Ecclesiastes are some of my favorite, partly because I have loved the song when it first hit the charts, but more so because it sums up for me the reality of life. As we know from watching the news these days and from our own life experiences, life is such a mixture of joy and sorrow, good and bad, seasons of growth and seasons of decline. There is not one of us who escapes that variety of seasons, and certainly not one of us who can avoid the last season, which closes out our time here on earth interacting with those we love. None of us know for certain what lies beyond that thin veil separating us from the world beyond the one we know. We each have our faith traditions, our own set of beliefs that give us hints. And so I have carried with me now for many years this simple belief that in the end, all of the cares and concerns and burdens of this life are lifted, and we experience absolute and eternal peace. And I also choose to believe, I have to believe, that those who have gone on before us will be there waiting to welcome us home. That reading with which we open this gathering today ends in this way. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good as long as they live, and that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. That is the gift of God. And so as we leave this time together, we trust that as George and his beloved wife Mary were inseparable partners here on earth, they are now dancing their way through eternity, enjoying the freedom from earth's cares and concerns promised by our God. And following his good example, we vow to use our days wisely, enjoying the time that is ours and reaching out to others with care and compassion.
Ladies and gentlemen, this now concludes our time here in the chapel. The interment service for Mr. McCauley's casket will happen on Monday at Park Lawn Cemetery. For those of you that are planning to attend, both Catherine and Nancy have maps of the cemetery, so please see them if you need to know where you're going. At this time, the family would like to invite everyone to gather with them for a time of fellowship and refreshments here at the funeral home on the upper level. For those of you that would need the elevator, our staff will be there to assist you. Would you please stand? We'll ask everyone to follow the family out as we leave from the chapel.
you.